Last week we started a series entitled The Glory of God, and we've been trying to come to grips with this idea that you actually find throughout the Bible. I even mentioned it in the verse about smoke earlier, around the glory of God. Last week, my title was, if I was to give it a title, The Glory of God in Himself. And we used the analogy of the sun. I'm not going to re-preach that message, but I used this picture last week to try and help us understand the word glory, because it got different meanings to different people. But the sun is 10,000 degrees Celsius at its surface, 1,000,000 degrees centigrade at its core, and it just beams out glorious light in every direction, a tiny fraction of which hits Earth. And think of the massive difference the sun makes. And yet if every person was blind, the sun would still continue to shine. In just the same way, God, if every person didn't believe in His existence, would continue to be glorious, if you like. Continue to radiate out. You can't look at the sun. It burns your eyes. And in fact, what you're looking at isn't even the sun. It's the rays from the sun that left 8 minutes and 20 seconds ago. And we used it as our analogy to help us understand that God, as He is in Himself, you couldn't properly see God. The Bible said no man can see Him and live. And yet His glory, and we define glory as this, we said His glory is the radiance of His perfections. So God in Himself is perfect and He's amazing. And the radiance of that shining out, we could call His glory. We said this as well last week. We asked this question, and this is kind of where we drove towards the back end of that message, is what is the chief and highest end of God? Many people would say, well, it's His love for us. But what about the time before humans existed? God surely wasn't short, wasn't imperfect, didn't have a hole in Him. And so we concluded that God's chief and highest end, from many different verses in the Bible, is to glorify God and fully to enjoy Him forever. And we said that His love flowed out of His passion for His own glory. And if you want to hear the full the reason of why this isn't arrogant or not, it's God-centered, and why it should be like that, you might like to listen to the back end of last week's podcast. I won't re-preach that, but just to let you know that God, if God was to glorify anything other than God, He'd be wrong, because there is no higher being than Himself. So I'd like to kick off with another verse that shows this idea of the supremacy of God, His passion for His own glory, and then to give you a bit of a roadmap, we're going to then come to a problem, and hopefully we can finish with a solution, and then you can go and have some cappuccinos and Zappa codes to nation changes, as you heard earlier. So this is from Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 through to 18. And I'm asking you, as you hear me read it, to just let these words hit you. Let me read it, and then come back to my wow. Colossians 1:15, the Son, Christ, is the image of the invisible God. He came, He stood on earth. That's what Paul's saying. You can't look directly at God, but Christ came to help us understand what God was like. The firstborn over all creation. Verse 16, for in Him, Christ, all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth. Things visible or invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through Him and for Him. You just pause with that slide. I'm going to carry on reading the next two verses. Paul is writing about Christ and about God. And he says something amazing. He says everything was made through Christ. Everything that exists, visible and invisible, powers, rulers, authorities, anything, whether in the universe here on earth, Everything was created through Christ. But I'd like you to take note of that last line on the screen. It's been created through him and for him. Can you get the sense from that how incredibly God-centered that is? Paul is saying in everything, every human being was created for God. Every star was created for him. Every flower was created for Christ. Every single thing was created through him and for him. This is so contrary to the idea that God exists for me. That so many people who claim to follow Christ believe. Christ doesn't exist for me. On the contrary, I was created for him. Thank you for that one bit of agreement out there. Although, as somebody said to me a little while back, he said, when my mother taught me when I was eating, chewing food, not to talk. And he says, sometimes I'm chewing on what you just said, and so I couldn't talk at the same time. I can work with that. Verse 17, it goes on to say, he is before all things. This is speaking about Jesus Christ. And in him, all things hold together. Think of this, the solar system that we're in. Read a news article this week that a little asteroid is coming between the moon and Earth. But it's not going to cause any damage, apparently. Just above where our satellites fly, there's going to be a little asteroid that goes through. Think of all the planets. Think of the sun. Think of their spin and how we rotate around the sun, and all the other planets rotate. And the Bible says in him all things hold together. Who holds the solar system from spinning out? Jesus Christ, according to Colossians 1. And then you think of that solar system in the Milky Way galaxy. Think of the Milky Way galaxy and all the other billions of galaxies all spinning, all rotating. This universe that they estimate is over 14 billion light years wide, and have no idea what's beyond that. All of it with energy. Where is this energy? What's holding it all together and keeping it all spinning? Christ is the answer from Colossians chapter 1. That's Paul's answer for it. It goes on to say this in verse 18, and he is the head of the body, the church. I didn't come here to preach on the church this morning, but just from this verse, this gives you an idea of how amazing the church is to Christ, how special the church is to him. It says he is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, and he has another God-centered phrase, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. God exists to glorify God and fully to enjoy him forever. Paul would agree with that in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 18. He says everything exists for Christ. And then he reiterates it just in case people like us missed it the first time. He says, so that in everything Christ might be supreme. Wow. I feel like I could read those verses another 10 times, say amen, and we're done with the meeting. But got some other things to say as well. Now here's the problem. Maybe I could word it like this. Is there any human being seated here who doesn't want to be satisfied or content or joy-filled or peace-filled? Is there anybody who, in your life, you don't want satisfaction, you don't want joy, you don't want peace, you don't want contentment? Our human drive is for our own happiness. It's for our own joy. It's our own satisfaction, and it's our own contentment. When we aren't feeling those things, we search for them. we go after them. It's as if we've got this inbuilt drive and desire to be happy. Anybody who doesn't want to be happy? We'll go to great lengths and do extraordinary things for our joy and for our happiness. Peer pressure for young and old works because of this. Well, those people seem happy, so that must be the route to happiness. Or those people look down on me because I'm like this, and so if I change that, maybe I could be as happy or as joyful as they appear to be. This is what drives us as humans. So, God exists for His glory, but I exist for my joy. This is my wiring. It's for my own joy. He created everything I've just read for Himself, and that has to include me. Could you see how this might be a problem? These two overwhelming forces, if you like, in my world, in my universe, seem to be at odds with each other. God exists for His glory, and I exist for joy, or for happiness, satisfaction, contentment, call it whatever you like, peace, this drive on the inside. Because I want to feel whatever that is. I've used some English words to describe it, but it's just when it's, yes. You can't really describe that, what goes on the inside. Where did this desire come from? This desire to be happy, this desire for joy. Well, let's try and unpack it, because they seem to be at odds with each other. And depending on how you've been taught the Bible, for some of us we've been taught your joy is of no value. You've got to follow God. And sadly, a whole lot of Christ followers seem to have absolutely no joy in their following of Christ. Sadly, many Christ followers seem to be some of the most miserable, grumbly, complaining people on the whole world. And that's really sad to me. My boy came to me the other day, he's 10 years old, and he had borrowed a screwdriver from my garage, and he had a little Nerf gun. He's been watching some YouTube videos of what guys do with their Nerf guns. If you don't know what that is, I don't actually know how to explain it, but it shoots these very, like little polystyrene type bullets. It's not a gun. Google it, Nerf gun. But his Nerf gun had stopped working. So he unscrewed every screw and took the whole thing apart. And then he came to me with what he had just done. And he said, I'm stuck. Can you help me fix my Nerf gun? And I got really, really stuck. But thankfully, there is YouTube. So we YouTubed and found where this missing piece that had fallen, where it went. It's still, we just need to put it back together again. But we were investigating the inside of the Nerf gun. Now, if you were to kind of unscrew us and search for this part on the inside, this thing that looks for and craves joy and satisfaction, it's like the motor. It's part of the engine in our soul. Where did that come from, that little part in my life? Well, maybe God put it there. Maybe it came from God. So maybe these two things aren't at odds, but how then do they tie together? Well, last week we looked at the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the Anglican Church and Presbyterian churches and some others use this as their catechism. And this was put together in the 1600s by a group of really learned people. And they opened by asking this question: what is the chief and highest end of man? And their answer was this: the chief and highest end of man, the reason that we exist, is to glorify God and fully to enjoy Him forever. That's a brilliant answer. A man by the name of John Piper said, what if we just tweaked one word in that sentence? Could we get even more out of it? He said, what if the answer lay in this? If we just made one subtle adjustment, and we said this, that man's chief and highest end is to glorify God by fully enjoying Him forever. And maybe God's glory and my joy and my happiness, my pursuit of satisfaction aren't at odds, but are tied up in each other. Some theologians, philosophers, actually developed an idea that goes something like this: is you shouldn't serve God from your own happiness or from your own joy. It should be out of duty. The Bible uses that word duty. There are some things, there are some aspects of us following Christ where he says we're like servants. But it would be totally incomplete to only speak of following him out of duty. I think that this idea of joy is tied up throughout the Bible. We'll go look at some verses, but let me use a very human analogy. Let's say that I arrived home one afternoon. I'm stumbling over my words here. And I had a bunch of flowers behind my back, white roses, because those are Jackie's favorite. I have found out. And I hold them out to her. And she says to me, "You're already the most perfect husband, but you're even more perfect now." And I say to her, "I did it out of duty." I set myself a reminder that here are the flowers. Why does that not work? Because even though there are duties and responsibilities, the driver of this human relationship of marriage should be joy. That's not to say every minute of my marriage I feel this ecstatic, overwhelming, overflowing joy. No. But the driver is, it's because I love you, and maybe if I really got out there, I couldn't help myself. These flowers are for you. Why then, when it comes to surely the biggest relationship that any human being could have, me with God, he made me for him, and when I find that click, why should that be out of, well, I read my Bible today out of duty for you, God? And Steph said that I should get involved in a life group, which is a brilliant suggestion from him. And so I'm going along, I'm joining a life group out of duty. And that was quite a nice song that I tapped my foot to this morning. This little light of mine. But I came to church out of duty. Isn't that the same as me handing the flowers out of duty? Shouldn't there be a driver of joy? So Piper, the guy who made that slight change in that sentence, went on to, this is a sentence that he put together to try and summarize this big idea. He said this: God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. God's glory and my joy aren't enemies of each other. In fact, they find each other. They were designed for each other. God is most glorified in me when I find my best joy and my best satisfaction in him. And if you like, I could take it this way around. I could say I am most satisfied in him when he is most glorified in me. The more glory from God that is shining into me and through me, the more satisfied I become, the more he's glorified. That kind of makes sense? I'm going to work with it a little bit. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. This is part B of last week's message. So God's passion for his own glory and my passion for contentment, joy, and satisfaction are a perfect match. Because in him I can, if my joy, my satisfaction, my contentment is in him, he's glorified in me, I have even more joy. This isn't to say, as I said earlier about those flowers and marriage, that every action involving my relationship with God immediately makes me feel happy. But it's to say this, that the pursuit of God and the enjoyment of God and the glorifying of God by me and my reveling in his lavish friendship and his kindness and his mercy and his incredible care will leave me more satisfied than the pursuit of anything else. C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to read a quote of his in a moment, but wrote a series of 7 children's books called The Chronicles of Narnia. I've been reading through those with my boy. I read them when I was a boy, and I'm reading through them again with him. And C.S. Lewis, this amazing author, writer, started out as an atheist and then became a Christian. His story of his conversion is a beautiful book called Surprised by Joy. Takes his idea of God and puts it into a children's book, and the central character, the character that represents Christ, is a lion called Aslan. And in the land of Narnia, which is a separate land that the children go to, whenever Aslan appears, a few things happen. There's power, there's change, and there's joy. Aslan corrects the children when they do something wrong, but he plays with them. In the book that I've just read, I think it's the 4th volume, or the 4th book in that series, when Aslan arrives, he goes on a tour of Narnia to make everything right, and 2 of the children are riding on his back. I don't know, maybe it's the little boy still inside of me, but kind of taking this idea of the one who makes everything right wants to enjoy my company and me to enjoy his, that we play together and work together and laugh together and cry together. But it's not God and me. And occasionally I drop in and say, God, please could you help me? It's my life finding satisfaction in him and thereby bringing him glory. C.S. Lewis said it like this. Now, this is writing to adults. Brilliant, brilliant quote. He says, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. So maybe the driver that searches for this joy and this passion, C.S. Lewis effectively says, we settle far too easily for things that don't in and of themselves satisfy and bring the long, everlasting, eternal joy, but those things, when enjoyed in the company of him, fill a life with joy and satisfaction. The writer who wrote those verses I read earlier in Colossians was Paul. And he wrote something incredible in Philippians chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. He said this, he said, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted. That's another word for glorified, or made, that Christ will be made big in my body, whether by life or by death. For, he said in verse 21, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. I want to hang on this verse just for a minute or two here, because this is such a big verse in this idea. Common sense says that dying is loss. Isn't that right? So if you hear that somebody is dying, or somebody tells you, I'm dying with this incurable disease, generally our first instinct is sympathy. Or if somebody has died, and we speak to those that remain, it's a fairly good human thing with our empathy, with compassion, to say, I'm sorry for your loss. Dying is loss. Unless you have got some incredible trauma going down, or stuff is happening, most people with healthy functioning minds don't wake up in the morning and think, well, I hope to die today. Quite on the contrary, we've got this tremendous will to live, to fight for life, to survive. And yet Paul writes this incredible verse. I mean, from almost any angle, it's amazing. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul, what were you on about? Why were you so excited about dying? And this isn't him. If you read the rest of the verse, he says, I want to live because God's got good stuff for me. But this is kind of his, if you like, life's theology or life motto. Maybe we find the answer in the previous verse, if you don't mind going back up to verse 20. At the back end, he says, I hope that I have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. So in other words, Paul is saying, my entire existence is here for him. Colossians chapter 1. And I hope that I've got the courage. He was writing this from prison, incidentally. He says, I hope I've got the courage that whether I'm alive or if I happen to die, no matter what happens to me, the number one thing to me is that Christ will be glorified, that I make much of him. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. I'd like to suggest this morning, that dying can only be gain when living is actually Christ. Essentially, Paul is saying, in the middle of a prison cell, and all the hardships I've endured, I have joy because my living is for the glory of Christ. He's most glorified in me and I'm most satisfied in him. And if somehow it happened that I was to die, it would be gain because I would have more of Christ. If living is any other thing but that word Christ, then dying is loss. But if living is Christ, then dying would be gain. Because on this earth, I have this relationship with him where I'm experiencing joy, but there's all the weaknesses that I carry and the sadnesses and the pain, the loss, etc., etc. But I'm living to glorify him. But dying is gain, Paul says, because I would then be with Christ, which he says is better by far. In another verse, Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18. He says, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, we look at God, we are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. We talk about glory, series on glory. So if we can find this word glory, we can take it and use it. And Paul seems to be, this idea of living is Christ and dying is gain, he seems to extend it a little bit here in 2 Corinthians 18. He's referring to an Old Testament story of Moses. And what happened is Moses went and he spoke with God in this special tent at the top of the mountain. And the Bible says when he came back, his face shone because he had been connecting with God. And so the people got surprised. They didn't want to talk to him. But eventually they came to know that whenever Moses' face was shining, it was because he had been hanging out with God. But the problem that Moses had is that the glory diminished. His face shone less and less. Then you go back to God, to start beaming again. So what Moses did is he took to wearing a veil. When he spoke to the people, he'd go speak to God. He'd come and talk to the people. His face would be shining. He'd deliver his message, and then he'd put a veil on so that nobody could know where the radiance was at, whether it was still shining or whether it had totally diminished. And Paul takes this idea and he says before Christ, there was a little bit of glory, but it was a diminishing kind of glory. Came in bursts and then diminished. That's why Moses ended up wearing this veil. But he says for those of us who come after Christ, surely the glory should increase. Our faces should shine more and more, essentially is what he's saying. And so he says we don't need to wear veils. That's where that reference comes from. We all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory. This comes from God, who is the Spirit. So there's two things that I'd like to take out of this verse. The first one, it says we with unveiled faces contemplate God's glory. This is Paul's way of saying we connect with God. The aim of our life is to glorify him. We look at him. We find out more about him. We pursue a deep relationship with him. a relationship of joy. And he says we contemplate the Lord's glory. We look at it. Some translations say we behold. But there's a different possible English word for this Greek word that's used, and that's the word reflect. So some Bibles read this, and we who with unveiled faces reflect the Lord's glory. I think both of them tie together. It's as I look at him, hopefully my face, or if you like, my life starts to shine, and that shining reflects out into the rest of the world. So people who have discovered what Paul discovered, that living is Christ and dying is gain, are people who look at God. And the sunshine of God hits our lives and is reflected. Thinking of that, this last week I saw the moon one of the evenings. The moon, when it's, especially just before, during, and after full moon, I don't know about you, but I find that quite a wow. It's fantastic. Here's a picture of the moon that somebody took. They called it the man in the moon because it's a hill with a little man on and the moon behind it. Now the moon orbits around Earth, but it doesn't shine any light of its own. All the light that the moon gets is from the sun. And a full moon is when the moon is on the opposite side of the earth to the sun. So if this is the moon, here's a spotlight here. So if this is the moon, it doesn't generate any light. But when it looks directly at the sun, bang, the light from the sun bounces off the moon. And there we are looking on the dark side of the earth saying, wow, isn't that beautiful? What you're seeing is sunlight. It's the sun's glory reflected off the moon. And we're saying, wow, just to that. And in a similar way, our lives were designed to be Christ-looking lives, and the light of Christ, the light of the sun, S-O-N, hits our lives and reflects off our lives and should create some level of wow, different ways and means in the world around us. Vanessa Goosen, the lady who shared at the Flourish Women's Conference, told an incredible story of ending up in a Thai jail for being a drug mule of drugs she was unaware she even had. She took a gift for a friend. And she was so angry and bitter and has this child in jail. But she says there was one lady in the entire Thai jail who stood out to her. It was a lady who was happy. And in this terrible situation, this lady would walk around, would greet everybody. Hello, good morning, how are you doing? And just was happy in spite of being in jail. That lady ended up being an influence on Vanessa's life that she came to faith in Christ. All these years later, Vanessa's traveling all around the country, busy telling people about God's glory, if you like. When she finished her session yesterday afternoon, I happened to be standing behind the production booth at the back there. And as she finished, she said, let us pray. I heard women in this auditorium weeping, sobbing, as God was doing something related to the stuff she had spoken about. I'm guessing about pain, bitterness, healing, forgiveness, all that kind of stuff. Can you see how this is glory reflected? There is a lady in a Thai jail, with this moon effect, looking at Christ. And her joy motor, her joy engine runs as a result. And in spite of the circumstance, just reflects joy by greeting. Just by greeting. Looking out for somebody else. And then Vanessa's life turns, if you like, towards the sun, S-O-N. And her life starts to reflect. And that starts to impact. And all of our light comes from him, starts to reflect. That's what Paul's saying. As we contemplate, we reflect the Lord's glory. But he then says this. He says a second thing happens. We get transformed as a result. So not only do we reflect the light, we are changed by the light. As I look at Christ and celebrate Christ and enjoy him, and through the tough and the easy times, be satisfied in him, I get transformed. Now, I'm not clever enough to know exactly how solar panels work. But do you remember when we had so much load shedding, and then it was horrible sitting in the darkness, and batteries would easily run out? So many people started installing solar panels. a good idea anyway, even without load shedding, as far as I can understand. And the big deal with solar panels is to get them onto the part of your roof that is facing the maximum amount of sun. Here in the southern hemisphere, that would be north. So those panels they're not facing getting the sun. In and of themselves, just dark panels. But as the sunlight hits them, they are transformed and give off energy that drives lights and stuff inside the house. I mean, what a cool invention. That you can stick a black piece of something on your roof and electricity is generated from that, just by that thing looking at the light. And as the sunlight hits those photoelectric cells, they are transformed to capture the energy and then give it off. I think that's such a cool idea of how my life was meant to be. In and of myself, nothing. But when the light of Christ starts to hit the different cells in my body, different kinds of energy is generated, and I start to be more helpful and more kind and more generous and more understanding, be more patient and more kind. And this is a work in progress because none of us could say, I've arrived. And so Paul says, if you don't mind going back to that verse, he says, so we are being transformed with ever-increasing glory. 2 Corinthians 3:18, we're being transformed with ever-increasing glory, which comes from God. So it's like he's saying, if my life today, what's the date today? 13th, Pat's birthday, I know that. 13th of September. Happy birthday, Pat. August. It's your birthday in August. No, I know it's today. Sorry, I'm just getting mixed up. 13th of August. Next week. Next month. 13th of September next year, the glory that's coming out of my life should be steadily increasing. Moses had a problem of fading glory, but ours is the joy of hopefully increasing glory. And do you see how it's possible to bail out of that process? We start to turn our shoulder to the light or our back to the sun. Only portion of it's hitting us, and we're not generating that same kind of transformation. And God's saying, the joy, the satisfaction, the contentment, the peace that I designed for you comes by facing me full on, allowing me to change, allowing me to adjust you. And then, speaking about ever-increasing glory, Paul writes another verse, and I'm coming in for a landing. He says this in Romans 8:18. He says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory, here's the word again, the glory that will be revealed in us. That's speaking about after this life. So if you tie those verses together, he says we've got this ever-increasing glory, this ever-increasing reflection, transformation, our lives changing, becoming more like Christ. And he says, although we've got these present sufferings, none of that's worth comparing to the future glory that will happen when I'm in the presence of Christ and I get a new body and I get a new eternity in front of me and everything is changed and it's much more than the upgrade, but it's definitely an upgrade. And he says, glory will be revealed in me there that will far outweigh anything that happened on this earth. I don't know about you, but all of this just sounds like incredibly good news. That my life was designed to connect with him for my satisfaction in his glory, my joy in his glory. And as I do that, I reflect his glory and I'm transformed by the glory, knowing that I'm going to become glorified. Romans 8, verse 18, when I'm in heaven with him one day. It's possible that there's some people here this morning that your life has been turned away from the Son, S-O-N, from Christ. And for whatever reason you got invited or you saw the signboard, you came along this morning and you managed to look past the stage that we hired and all the other stuff. During this hour and a half that we spent together, figured out that actually my life was designed for Christ. But not in the sad, well, I've got to give up everything that's fun. I've got to give up all joy and come and be baptized in lemon juice. Give up everything to him and, well, he's going to ruin my life. Of course he'll ruin our life, but it's ruined for the good. It's leaving the mud pies in the slum for the beach holiday And once you've had that, you're ruined from playing with mud pies. It's that kind of ruin. And this isn't a kind of a false, it's all so lovely, I just hear angels. No, this is a gritty, persevering kind of joy and satisfaction, a contentment that I'm following him, and to live is Christ and to die is gain. And if to live is anything else for you, I'd have put that verse back up, Philippians 1:21, but it was your book that you wrote. What would you fill in that word with? To live is ... and to die is what? Because only if the word there is Christ can dying be gain. If the ... is anything else, then dying is loss.